Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily just for you. Emily Clark's hands tightened around the steering wheel as her car rumbled down the narrow, fog-covered road. The headlights barely pierced the dense mist that hung like a shroud over the lonely landscape. Trees with skeletal branches loomed on either side, their gnarled limbs reaching out like the fingers of the dead. The eerie silence was broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath her tires as she approached her destination, the infamous Vandermeer house. For as long as Emily could remember, tales of the old mansion on Blackwood Road had swirled through the town of Hollow Pines like dark secrets carried on the wind. The Vandermeer house was whispered to be cursed, abandoned for decades, shunned by locals, and left to decay under the weight of its sinister reputation. No one dared to approach it after sunset, and the few who did never spoke of what they saw within its crumbling walls. But Emily wasn't like the townsfolk. As a freelance journalist with a taste for the macabre, she had spent years chasing stories of haunted houses, urban legends, and the supernatural. She lived for the thrill of unraveling mysteries, and the Vandermeer house promised to be her biggest story yet. Skeptics had called her a sensationalist, but she knew that every legend had a kernel of truth hidden within it. The fog thinned as Emily turned onto the overgrown driveway leading up to the house. The moment she saw it, her heart skipped a beat. The old mansion loomed before her, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlit sky. Vines twisted up its walls like veins on decaying skin, and the shattered windows were like empty eye sockets, staring into the abyss. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, sending a shiver down her spine. Emily parked her car and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. The temperature seemed to drop by several degrees as she approached the house, her breath misting in the frigid air. She had read all the stories, how Eliza Vandermeer and her family had vanished without a trace over a century ago, leaving the house to rot. Some said the Vandermeers had dabbled in dark rituals. Others claimed the house was built on cursed ground, but no one knew for sure, and that was what she intended to uncover. The porch groaned under her weight as she climbed the crumbling steps. The door was a towering slab of weathered oak, its surface etched with deep gouges. For a moment, Emily hesitated, the warnings she had heard playing in her mind. Old Mrs. Hargrove at the town's general store had looked her dead in the eyes and whispered, "No one who goes in there ever comes back the same." But Emily was determined. She reached for the rusty doorknob and twisted it. To her surprise, the door swung open with a slow, agonizing creak, as if the house itself were breathing out a long sigh after years of silence. The darkness inside seemed almost alive, pooling like ink beyond the threshold. "Hello?" Emily called out, her voice wavering slightly. But the only response was the low groan of the wind as it swept through the nearby trees. Steeling herself, she stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something acrid that stung her nostrils. She pulled out her flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a grand foyer covered in dust and cobwebs. The floorboards creaked under her weight, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. As she moved deeper into the house, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The portraits lining the walls were faded and peeling, but their eyes seemed to follow her every move. She shone her flashlight on one of them, a young woman with hauntingly pale skin and hollow eyes. The brass nameplate at the bottom read, "Eliza Vandermeer." Emily's heart thudded in her chest. She had read about Eliza, the last known resident of the house. According to the sparse records she had found in the town archives, Eliza had been a recluse, only seen through the attic window, her eyes staring out at the world as if searching for something, or someone. The sound of wood creaking behind her made Emily whirl around, but there was nothing there, just the shadows stretching along the walls like black fingers. She forced herself to breathe slowly, convincing herself it was just the old house settling. But there was an undeniable chill in the air, as if something unseen was brushing against her skin. Pressing on, she walked through the grand hall, her footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. As she passed by a broken grandfather clock, something glinted in the corner of her eye. Turning, she saw a small, dusty object lying on the floor near the staircase. It was an old, leather-bound journal, half buried under a thick layer of dust. Kneeling down, Emily picked it up. The cover was cracked, and the pages were brittle with age. As she flipped it open, her eyes widened. The faded handwriting was neat but shaky, as if written by someone on the brink of madness. The first entry was dated October 3rd, 1893, and it chronicled the thoughts of Eliza Vandermeer herself. The entries were cryptic, filled with references to strange noises, flickering shadows, and the feeling of being watched. One line in particular sent chills down Emily's spine. "They come in the night. I hear them whispering behind the walls. I fear for my soul." A sudden crash echoed through the house, followed by the sound of footsteps heavy and deliberate. Emily snapped her head up, her pulse racing. The sound came from upstairs, where the attic was located, the place where Eliza had spent her final days. Gripping the journal tightly, Emily took a deep breath and made her way toward the staircase. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to know what happened to Eliza Vandermeer and what secrets this house held. As she ascended the stairs, the whispering began. Faint and unintelligible, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the house itself was speaking to her. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to writhe and pulse, alive with a malevolent energy. When she reached the top, she froze. The door to the attic was ajar, and from the darkness beyond, a soft, rhythmic tapping echoed. It was the unmistakable sound of fingernails drumming on wood. And then, just for a moment, she saw it, a pale, ghostly face staring at her from the shadows. The eyes were hollow, black pits, and a twisted smile spread across its lips. Emily's scream caught in her throat as the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her in the darkness. Emily's heart pounded as she stood in the darkness at the top of the staircase, her flashlight flickering weakly. The air was thick and cold, pressing against her like an unseen weight. The attic door had slammed shut behind her with such force that she had to steady herself against the wall to keep from tumbling backward. For a moment, she was plunged into total silence, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. Gathering her courage, Emily twisted the old brass knob of the attic door, but it refused to budge. She pushed harder, leaning her shoulder into it, but it was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Panic bubbled up in her chest, but she forced it down. She couldn't afford to lose her nerve now. She still had Eliza's journal clutched in her hands, a fragile lifeline to whatever secrets this house held. Stepping away from the door, she flipped open the journal with trembling fingers. The entries were written in elegant, flowing script, though the ink had faded to a dull brown over the years. She skimmed through the earlier pages, which seemed mundane enough, descriptions of the weather, notes on household affairs, but the tone changed abruptly in late October of 1893. October 20th, 1893, I hear them again. The whispers are growing louder. They move through the walls at night, their voices like wind through the trees. Mother says, it is just my imagination, but I know better. Something lives in this house. It watches us, waiting. A chill raced down Emily's spine as she read the words. She turned the page, her fingers leaving faint smudges on the aged paper. The next entry was messier, the handwriting jagged and uneven. October 23rd, 1893. I saw one today. A shadow with eyes like burning coals. It was only for a moment, but it was there, lurking at the edge of my vision. When I turned to face it, it vanished. They grow bolder with each passing night. Mother has fallen ill, but the doctor says there is nothing wrong with her. She speaks in her sleep now, words I do not understand. Emily's flashlight flickered again, the weak beam barely penetrating the suffocating darkness of the hallway. She could feel the shadows pressing in closer, as if they were reaching for her. The air was heavy with the smell of damp rot, and something else she couldn't quite identify, a faint metallic tang, like rusted iron or old blood. Determined to keep moving, she walked back down the staircase, the steps creaking ominously beneath her. She needed to find another room, somewhere she could sit and read the journal more carefully. The house seemed to groan around her, settling into its ancient bones as though it were aware of her presence. Emily reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself in a narrow hallway lined with decaying wallpaper that peeled off in long, ragged strips. The doors to the left and right were closed, their brass knobs tarnished with age. She chose the one on her left, pushing it open with a reluctant creak. Inside was what must have once been a study. Dust-covered books filled sagging shelves, and a large oak desk stood in the center, its surface cluttered with yellowed papers and broken quills. Emily moved toward the desk, her eyes scanning the room. This place seemed almost untouched, as if the house had preserved it, waiting for someone to return. She set the journal down on the desk and flipped to the next entry. October 28th, 1893, I am certain now. The shadows are real. They are no mere tricks of the light. Last night I woke to find one standing at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I could not move, could not scream. It whispered to me in a language I did not understand, its voice like the rasping of dead leaves. When it left, I found a mark on my wrist, a strange symbol I cannot erase. Emily's eyes widened. She flipped the page, but the ink had smudged, making the next few lines almost unreadable. She could make out fragments. Mother's condition worsens. The doctor refuses to return. The servants have fled in terror. As she tried to decipher the rest, the temperature in the room plummeted. Emily could see her breath clouding in the air. The light from her flashlight dimmed to a faint glow, and then, abruptly, it went out. She was plunged into total darkness. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper filled the room. It was barely more than a murmur, a hissing sound that sent ice-cold fear shooting through her veins. Emily's heart raced as she fumbled with her flashlight, her fingers shaking. The whispers grew louder, like a chorus of voices overlapping, each one whispering her name. Emily. She turned frantically, trying to pinpoint the source, but the voices seemed to come from every direction at once. She reached for the journal again, desperate for some clue, some way to stop whatever was happening. Her fingers brushed the leather cover, and as she opened it, she saw a new entry had appeared on the page in front of her. The ink was fresh, glistening in the dim light that seeped through a crack in the boarded-up windows. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. They see you, Emily. They know you are here. You must leave before it's too late, before they claim you as they did me. Emily's blood turned to ice. How could that be possible? The journal had been written over a century ago. Was the house trying to communicate with her, or was something far more sinister at play? The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and Emily felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She turned toward the doorway, and that's when she saw it, something moving in the shadows. It was barely more than a dark blur, but its eyes glowed like embers in the dark. It moved closer, the shadows twisting and writhing around it like a living shroud. Panicking, Emily grabbed the journal and backed away, her hands trembling. The thing in the shadows seemed to hesitate, its glowing eyes fixed on the book. In a flash of inspiration, Emily realized that whatever these entities were, they were somehow bound to the journal's contents. Without wasting another second, she bolted from the room. The thing behind her let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that reverberated through the old house like a death knell. Emily raced down the hallway, the journal pressed to her chest as if it were a shield. She had to get out of this cursed place before whatever haunted it decided she was the next soul it would claim. But as she reached the front door, it refused to budge. The whispers were deafening now, surrounding her in a cacophony of desperate, hungry voices. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went silent. The house seemed to hold its breath. Emily turned slowly, her back against the door, her eyes darting through the darkness. The shadows seemed to ripple and part, revealing something scrawled on the wall in fresh, dripping ink. "You can't leave. You're one of us now." A single cold breath brushed past her ear, and a voice soft, almost tender, whispered, "Welcome home, Emily." In that moment, she realized the true horror. She was no longer an intruder in the Vandermeer house. She was a prisoner. Emily's panicked breaths came out in ragged gasps as she leaned against the front door, its cold wood pressing into her back. The whispers had stopped, the house falling into an unsettling, deathly silence. But she could still feel the lingering presence of whatever dark force had spoken to her. She pushed against the door again, but it remained sealed shut, as though the house itself had decided she was not allowed to leave. Steeling herself, Emily forced her shaking hands to steady. She had faced strange things before, rumors of hauntings, cryptic messages scrawled in hidden places, but nothing like this, nothing so immediate, so terrifyingly real. She needed to calm down and think. Panicking wouldn't get her out of here. She glanced at her phone. The battery was at 43%, but there was no signal, not even a single bar. The house seemed to be in a dead zone, cut off from the rest of the world. As she tucked the phone back into her pocket, she turned her attention to the journal she still held in her hands. The fresh, frantic handwriting that had appeared earlier had dried, becoming almost indistinguishable from the older entries. "They see you, Emily. They know you are here." The words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that she was being watched. She needed answers, and this journal seemed to be her only lead. But she couldn't focus while standing at the front door, her back exposed to the shadows that seemed to have a mind of their own. She needed to find a safe place to set up her equipment and figure out her next move. Gripping the journal tightly, Emily made her way down the dark hallway. The house seemed to shift around her, the shadows lengthening and pooling like ink spilled on old parchment. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the broken windows made her jump. She turned into what she assumed was the living room, her flashlight beam sweeping across moth-eaten furniture and layers of dust that had settled like a thick shroud. A large, ornate fireplace dominated one wall. Above it hung a cracked mirror that seemed to reflect the darkness back at her in an almost malevolent way. This room, though decrepit, felt relatively free of the oppressive energy she had felt earlier. It would have to do for now. Emily set her backpack down on the faded carpet and began unpacking her gear. She had come prepared with a few essentials: a portable audio recorder, a high-powered lantern, and an old Polaroid camera she had found in a thrift store. The camera was temperamental, but she liked the immediacy of seeing what she captured. The lantern's warm glow was a relief from the harsh beam of her flashlight, casting the room in a soft yellow light that made it feel almost normal. Almost. She placed the journal on the coffee table and took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. If she could make it through this night, she might find a way out when daylight came. Emily turned on the audio recorder and set it next to the journal. "This is Emily Clark," she said, her voice low and steady. "It's 11:47 p.m. I'm inside the Vandermeer house, alone. So far I've encountered something, voices, whispers, and possibly entities. The journal appears to be updating itself. I need to understand how and why." As she spoke, her eyes kept darting to the corners of the room where the shadows seemed to swirl and writhe. The house felt alive, as if it were listening to her, waiting for her to let her guard down. With a quick, nervous glance at the door, Emily flipped the journal open again. This time she focused on the later entries, hoping to find some clue that would help her survive the night. November 3rd, 1893. I am alone. The servants have fled, and Mother is gone. I can hear the things in the walls they whisper to me, promising freedom if I join them. I do not trust their words. The shadows grow darker each night. their eyes burning holes into my soul. I have locked myself in the attic, but I know it will not keep them out for long. They are coming for me. Emily paused, her eyes scanning the lines. Eliza's fear was palpable, as if it had soaked into the pages themselves. She flipped forward to the final entry, hoping it would reveal what had happened on that last terrible night. But before she could begin reading, the lantern flickered, casting the room into a strobe-like dance of light and shadow. Emily's heart leaped into her throat. She glanced at the lantern, then froze. There, reflected in the cracked mirror above the fireplace, was the silhouette of a figure standing directly behind her. Whirling around, Emily saw nothing. The room was empty, the only sound her own ragged breathing. She turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. Had she imagined it? Or was it another one of the house's tricks? Her hands shook as she reached for the Polaroid camera. She needed proof, something tangible she could take with her, even if she managed to escape. She snapped a few photos of the room, the camera's flash momentarily blinding her. The film whirred as it printed out the photos, and she set them aside to develop while she tried to focus on the journal again. But before she could read another word, the audio recorder crackled to life with a burst of static. Emily leaned closer, her pulse quickening. The static gave way to faint whispers, overlapping and distorted. Then a voice came through, clear as a bell, a woman's voice. "You shouldn't be here, Emily." Her blood ran cold. She recognized that voice. It was the same one she had heard on her phone earlier, the one claiming to be Eliza Vandermeer. "Who are you?" Emily demanded, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" The recording continued, but the voice did not answer her question. Instead, it repeated the same chilling phrase. "They are coming. You must hide." Suddenly, all the lights went out, the lantern, the flashlight, everything, plunging the room into complete darkness. Emily's eyes struggled to adjust as she grabbed the Polaroids, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped them. Holding one of the photos up to her face, she squinted to make out the image. Her heart stopped. There, in the grainy black and white photo, was the unmistakable shape of a figure standing in the doorway behind her. Its eyes were two pinpoints of light, and it was grinning, its mouth stretched unnaturally wide. A sound came from the hallway, a slow, deliberate scraping, like nails dragging against the wooden floor. The whispers returned, louder now, insistent. Emily's mind raced. She needed to hide, just like the voice had told her. Clutching the journal and her camera, she dove behind the tattered sofa, pressing herself into the narrow gap between it and the wall. The scraping grew louder, closer, and she could hear the thing breathing now, a wet, rasping sound that made her stomach churn. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stifle her breaths. The room was freezing, her breath forming clouds in the air. The thing in the hallway stopped just outside the living room, its shadow stretching into the room like a black stain. The whispers turned to laughter, low and mocking. The thing knew where she was hiding. It was playing with her, savoring her fear. Emily shut her eyes, clutching the journal to her chest like a lifeline, her only hope that the night would end before whatever was out there found her. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The house fell into a silence so deep it felt suffocating. Emily waited, every muscle in her body tensed, but the presence seemed to retreat. After what felt like an eternity, she dared to peek out from behind the sofa. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. She knew now that the house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it had no intention of letting her leave. Emily's heart continued to pound as she crawled out from behind the sofa, her limbs stiff from staying so tense for so long. She clutched the journal and Polaroids to her chest, her hands shaking. The house had gone quiet again, but she could still feel its oppressive presence, like it was watching her every move. Whatever had been in the hallway had retreated, but she knew it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to slip up. The photographs she had taken earlier were now fully developed. With trembling hands, she spread them out on the coffee table, hoping for some clue or explanation. Each image showed the dark, decaying room she was in, but in every single one there was a shadowy figure. Sometimes it stood in the doorway, other times it hovered in a corner, its eyes glowing faintly like embers. Emily's stomach churned as she realized the figures had been following her, watching her, and she hadn't even known it. The final photograph sent a chill down her spine. It showed her crouching behind the sofa, taken from an angle that suggested it had been snapped from directly above her. But that was impossible. She had been alone, or at least she thought she had been. Swallowing hard, she stuffed the Polaroids into her backpack and picked up the journal. The entry she had left off on seemed to have changed. The words appeared smeared and distorted, as if someone or something had tampered with it. But the message was clear enough. The eyes, they see you wherever you go. Do not look at them for too long, or they will take you. The words echoed in her mind as she stood up, her legs trembling. She needed to keep moving. Staying in one place made her too vulnerable. As much as she wanted to flee, the front door remained locked, as if sealed by some malevolent force. Her only option was to venture deeper into the house and find another way out. She gathered her courage and headed back into the hallway. The air was frigid, and the darkness seemed almost tangible, like she was wading through it. The house groaned around her, its ancient timbers creaking as though it were shifting and settling. Emily wondered if the house was trying to trap her, to lead her to places where it could toy with her mind. She turned a corner and found herself in a long, dimly lit corridor lined with old portraits. The flickering beam of her flashlight revealed dust-covered paintings in heavy, ornate frames. Each portrait depicted members of the Vandermeer family, their faces frozen in time, staring out at the viewer with eyes that seemed too lifelike. Emily moved slowly down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. The faces in the portraits were expressionless, yet their eyes seemed to follow her. She could feel their cold gazes burning into her back as she walked, making her skin prickle with unease. She paused in front of one portrait that stood out from the rest. It was of a woman dressed in a flowing black gown, her hair cascading in dark waves around her shoulders. The plaque beneath it read, Eliza Vandermeer, 1893. The woman's eyes were large and dark, her expression one of sadness, almost pleading. Emily leaned in closer, drawn to the painting despite the gnawing sense of dread in her stomach. There was something about Eliza's eyes that seemed almost alive, as if they were silently trying to convey a message. For a fleeting moment, Emily could swear she saw the woman's lips move, whispering something too faint to hear. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the corridor, sending a shiver down her spine. Emily turned her head sharply, her flashlight beam darting back and forth, but the hallway was empty. When she turned back to the painting, her heart nearly stopped. The eyes of Eliza in the portrait were no longer staring straight ahead. They were looking directly at Emily. A low, breathy whisper filled the air, like the rustling of dry leaves. Emily staggered backward, her flashlight shaking in her hand. She could hear the whisper growing louder, but it wasn't coming from the painting, it was coming from behind her. She spun around, expecting to see one of the shadowy figures, but the corridor was still empty. The whispers continued, a chorus of overlapping voices, like 100 secrets spoken at once. They were coming from everywhere, yet nowhere at all. Desperate to escape, Emily backed away from the portraits, her heart racing. She was nearly at the end of the hallway when her flashlight flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. For a moment, she was blind, disoriented, and she could feel the eyes of the portraits boring into her, even in the pitch black. She fumbled with the flashlight, smacking it against her palm until it flickered back to life. When the light returned, the hallway was different. The portraits were no longer still. Their eyes had changed, their faces twisted into expressions of rage and agony. The once stoic faces were now contorted, mouths open in silent screams. Emily's scream caught in her throat as she stumbled backward, her flashlight beam swinging wildly. The air around her grew colder, and the whispers intensified. turning into something more like growls. The shadows at the end of the hallway began to shift and coalesce, forming a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes. Panicking, Emily turned and ran, not caring where she was going as long as it was away from whatever was forming behind her. She burst through a doorway at the end of the hall and slammed it shut behind her, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The room she found herself in was another parlor, but this one was filled with the sound of ticking dozens of clocks, all synchronized to the same time. The constant, rhythmic ticking seemed to grow louder, echoing off the walls and threatening to drive her mad. She looked around wildly, trying to get her bearings, when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Every clock in the room was frozen at exactly 3:33 a.m., the same time that was mentioned in Eliza's journal as the hour when the shadows came to claim her. Emily checked her watch. It was only 12:05 a.m. The clocks were stuck at that ominous hour, as if they were waiting for something. In the corner of the room was another portrait, larger and more imposing than the others. This one was covered with a dusty, moth-eaten sheet. Emily hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. She approached it slowly, reaching out with a trembling hand to pull the sheet away. As the cloth fell to the floor, Emily gasped. The portrait was not of a member of the Vandermeer family. It was a painting of her, Emily Clark, her own face staring back at her with an expression of horror. But it was not just any version of herself. It was her, dressed in the clothes she was wearing at that very moment, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Underneath the portrait, scrawled in red letters, was a single, chilling phrase. "Welcome to the family, Emily." The whispers returned, louder than ever, surrounding her in a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very air around her. The shadows in the room began to move, creeping closer, their forms becoming more defined, more solid. Emily's vision blurred as panic overtook her. She stumbled backward, bumping into a grandfather clock that toppled with a deafening crash. The shadows surged toward her, reaching out with skeletal hands. In a desperate bid to escape, Emily turned and sprinted out of the room, the sound of the ticking clocks and the mocking whispers following her as she fled deeper into the darkness of the house. The house wasn't just trying to trap her. It was trying to claim her soul. Emily's heart pounded as she fled down the darkened hallway, the whispers from the portraits echoing in her ears. The house seemed to be closing in on her, the walls creaking and groaning as if they were alive, hungry. She had lost track of where she was. Every corridor looked the same, each door leading to a new nightmare. The sensation of being watched never left her, and every time she turned a corner, she half expected to see the glowing eyes of those shadowy figures waiting for her. She skidded to a halt in front of a door she hadn't noticed before. It was old, made of splintered wood, and looked as if it hadn't been opened in decades. The door was different from the others. It was tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Emily's gut twisted as she stared at it, a chill seeping into her bones. This door didn't belong. It was as if the house itself had created it just for her. Hoping that this might lead to an escape route, Emily reached for the door handle. The brass knob was icy cold, sending a jolt through her fingers as she twisted it. The door creaked open with a sound like a dying animal, and a waft of rancid air hit her like a physical force, making her gag. She pulled the collar of her shirt over her nose and stepped through. On the other side was a narrow, spiraling staircase that descended into darkness. The walls were lined with damp, crumbling stone, and the air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. The stairwell seemed to go down forever, the darkness at the bottom like a yawning mouth waiting to swallow her whole. Emily hesitated at the top of the stairs. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to find another way out, but the relentless whispering behind her was growing louder. Whatever was lurking in the upper levels of the house was closing in. She had no choice. She took a deep breath and began to descend, her footsteps echoing ominously. The deeper she went, The colder it became, the air growing thicker, almost syrupy, like she was wading through a nightmare. Her flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely penetrating the inky darkness ahead. She kept one hand on the wall to steady herself, the cold stone damp and slimy under her fingers. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a cavernous basement. The ceiling was so high it vanished into shadows, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of murky water that seeped into her shoes. The air was heavy, with a nauseating stench, rotting meat, old blood, and something worse that she couldn't identify. As she moved further into the basement, her flashlight illuminated strange symbols painted on the walls in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. They were twisted, alien shapes that made her head throb if she looked at them for too long. The journal had mentioned symbols like these, but the entries had been too vague to decipher their purpose. Emily's pulse quickened as she remembered Eliza's final words. The basement. They are waiting in the dark. The oppressive darkness seemed to pulse around her, as if it were alive. And then she saw it. A door on the far side of the basement, slightly ajar. Dim, flickering light spilled out from the crack, casting twisted shadows on the walls. It was the only light source she had seen in this pitch-black place. As she approached the door, she heard a faint noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood. Her heart thudded painfully as she realized the sound was coming from behind the door. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the handle. But there was no turning back now. Whatever was in this house, it wanted her to come closer. She pushed the door open with a trembling hand. The room beyond was small, more like a cell than a proper room. Candles were scattered across the floor, their flames flickering weakly as if they could be snuffed out at any moment. The walls were covered in more of those strange symbols, glowing faintly in the candlelight. In the center of the room was an old wooden table. On it lay the skeletal remains of a figure, half-rotted, its hands bound together with rusted chains. Emily's stomach churned as she took in the gruesome sight. The corpse's skull was partially caved in, and its empty eye sockets seemed to stare directly at her. But that wasn't what made her blood run cold. Clutched in the skeletal fingers of the corpse was another journal, identical to the one she had found upstairs. The leather cover was cracked and darkened, as though stained with blood. It was almost as if this journal had been waiting for her, placed here deliberately. Emily's hand shook as she reached for the journal. The moment her fingers touched it, the candles flickered violently, nearly extinguishing. She could feel the cold presence of something behind her, watching with those glowing eyes. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room with a cacophony of voices that seemed to be speaking directly into her mind. "Read it," they hissed. "Know the truth." Her instincts screamed at her to drop the book and run, but she couldn't resist the pull. She flipped it open to the first page, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw her own name scrawled in messy, desperate handwriting. "Emily Clark, you should never have come here. You cannot escape. The house knows you. It is part of you now." The handwriting wasn't old, it looked fresh, as if someone had written it only moments before. She turned the page, and the words seemed to blur and shift before her eyes, forming new sentences, as if the book was writing itself in real time. "The basement is their domain. They took me, Eliza Vandermeer, and now they have you. There is no escape, for they feed on fear. If you see them, do not run. Do not scream. They will take it as an invitation." Emily's hands shook so violently, she almost dropped the journal. Her breaths were coming in short, panicked gasps. She had to get out of here. She slammed the journal shut and turned toward the door, but the basement seemed to warp around her, the walls pulsing like a living organism. The shadows in the room began to coalesce, forming dark, hulking shapes. She could see glowing eyes watching her from every corner, dozens of them, like predatory animals waiting to pounce. The whispers grew into a cacophony of laughter, mocking and cruel. As the shadows began to crawl closer, Emily realized with a sickening dread that they had no intention of letting her leave. Summoning every ounce of willpower, she bolted for the door, the journal still clutched in her hand. She could hear the sloshing of water and the scraping of claws behind her as the shadows surged forward. Her feet slipped on the wet floor, but she managed to keep her balance as she dashed up the stairs. The laughter and whispers followed her, growing louder and more frenzied. The air seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe, as if the house itself was trying to suffocate her. She burst through the door at the top of the stairs and slammed it shut behind her, her heart hammering in her chest. For a moment, everything was silent. She was back in the main part of the house, the oppressive darkness of the basement left behind. But as she leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, she noticed something that sent chills down her spine. Carved into the wood of the door in deep, jagged letters were the words, "You cannot run, Emily. You belong to us now." Terror gripped her as she realized the house was not going to let her go. It was playing with her, drawing her deeper into its web of darkness. And somewhere, deep within its rotting walls, the shadows were waiting for her to finally give in. Emily staggered away from the basement door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The words carved into the wood seemed to glow with a faint, otherworldly light, mocking her futile attempt to escape. The house was playing with her, like a cat toying with its prey. Every door she had tried, every hall she had raced down, had only led her deeper into its dark, twisted embrace. It was a maze with no exit, a trap with no release. The journal she had taken from the basement weighed heavily in her hands. The fresh, scrawled warnings were playing in her mind. "They took me, Eliza Vandermeer. They will take you too." She couldn't think straight. Her mind was a whirlwind of panic, the whispering voices still echoing faintly in her ears. She needed a place to hide, somewhere to gather her thoughts and figure out a plan. As she made her way down another shadow-filled corridor, she caught a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of her vision. Her flashlight flickered, threatening to go out, and the temperature in the hallway dropped sharply. Faint laughter, high-pitched, almost childlike, echoed from somewhere behind her. Emily froze, turning her head slowly toward the sound. Her flashlight beam wavered, and for a moment she saw them. Small figures darting in and out of the shadows, their forms barely more than black silhouettes with glowing eyes. "Children," she whispered, her voice trembling. But these were not the children of happy memories or innocent games. There was something deeply wrong about the way they moved, jerky, unnatural, like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. Before she could react, the figures darted out of sight, their laughter fading into the distance. Emily's pulse quickened. Were they leading her somewhere? Or were they trying to trap her? She couldn't tell, but she felt an inexplicable pull to follow them. It was as if the house itself was urging her on. She turned a corner and found herself in front of a large wooden door, its surface covered with strange carved symbols, similar to the ones she had seen in the basement. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack she could see the flicker of candlelight. She hesitated, but the sounds of whispering and giggling echoed down the hall behind her, urging her forward. Emily pushed the door open and stepped into a dimly lit nursery. The room was like a snapshot from another time, filled with antique toys, rocking horses, and a dusty cradle in the corner. Faded wallpaper, decorated with images of smiling cherubs, peeled from the walls, giving the room a haunting, abandoned feel. The air here was thick with a cloying sweetness that made her stomach turn. The laughter of the children had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on her ears. Emily cautiously walked deeper into the room, her flashlight beam sweeping over the toys strewn across the floor. Each step she took stirred up a cloud of dust that shimmered in the candlelight like motes of ash. As she approached the cradle, a cold breeze blew through the room, even though the windows were tightly boarded up. The air seemed to hum with energy, like the crackle before a storm. Emily's skin prickled with unease as she peered into the cradle, half expecting to see something horrific within. But it was empty. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she turned away, she heard a soft, pitiful sobbing like a child crying. Emily's heart clenched. She turned slowly toward the source of the sound, her flashlight flickering again. There, in the corner of the room, stood a small figure. A young girl with long, tangled hair and a tattered dress. Her back was turned, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Hey, are you okay?" Emily whispered, her voice cracking. It seemed absurd to ask, given everything she had seen so far, but something in her couldn't help reaching out to the figure. The girl stopped crying, her body going unnaturally still. Slowly, she turned to face Emily, and Emily's blood turned to ice. The child's eyes were black, hollow voids, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile that stretched too wide, showing teeth that were jagged and sharp. "You shouldn't have come here," the child said in a voice that was not her own. It was deep, guttural, as if a dozen voices were speaking through her at once. "They're hungry, and you smell so delicious." Before Emily could react, the girl's form seemed to dissolve, evaporating into a cloud of black mist that shot across the room. The door behind Emily slammed shut, and the candles in the room extinguished, plunging her into total darkness. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat as something cold and small wrapped around her ankles. She looked down, her flashlight barely illuminating the dark shapes swarming around her feet. It was the children, dozens of them, their eyes glowing faintly, their twisted smiles widening as they reached for her with skeletal fingers. Panic surged through Emily as she kicked frantically, trying to free herself. The children's laughter grew louder, shrill and hysterical, as if they were delighted by her fear. Their grip tightened, pulling her toward the center of the room, where a gaping hole had appeared in the floor, like a maw waiting to swallow her whole. "No!" she screamed, thrashing against the phantom hands. She could feel them tugging at her, their icy fingers digging into her skin, dragging her toward the darkness. Desperation clawed at her mind. She remembered the journal she had taken from the basement and, in a last-ditch effort, yanked it from her backpack. With shaking hands, she opened it and began to read the incantations scrawled in Eliza's desperate handwriting. The words made no sense to her, but they felt charged with some kind of power. As she read aloud, the children shrieked, their hands loosening their grip. The air in the room seemed to vibrate, a low hum that grew louder with each word she spoke. The shadows around her began to writhe and pull back as if repelled by the incantation. The black hole in the floor started to close, the edges drawing inward like a wound healing itself. The children's laughter turned to agonized screams, and one by one, they dissolved into wisps of smoke, vanishing into the darkness. Breathing hard, Emily continued to chant until the last of the shadows disappeared. The room was suddenly still, the air clear of the oppressive presence that had suffocated her moments ago. She collapsed to the floor, the journal slipping from her fingers as she gasped for breath. The nursery was silent once more, the toys lying lifeless on the floor, the cradle empty. Emily's body shook with exhaustion, her limbs trembling from the adrenaline that coursed through her veins. She had survived, but she knew it was only temporary. The house wasn't finished with her yet. As she tried to gather her strength, she noticed something new in the journal. The words on the page seemed to have rearranged themselves, forming a single ominous message. "They are the lost ones, but there are others, darker, hungrier. The children are merely the beginning. The true darkness lies beneath, where the roots of this cursed house run deep. You cannot leave until you face them." Emily stared at the message, her heart sinking. The basement had been only the first layer. There were deeper horrors waiting for her, horrors that would not be satisfied until they consumed her completely. She had escaped the phantom children, but the house was far from done with her. And now she understood. It was drawing her deeper into its heart, into the darkness beneath, where the real monsters lived. The air in the nursery was stifling, thick with the remnants of fear and whispered voices. Emily's hands were still trembling as she gathered the scattered pages of the journal. Her legs felt weak beneath her, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. She had no idea how much longer she could keep running. The house was relentless, twisting and shifting its corridors to trap her, throwing horrors at her that defied reason. But she couldn't give up now. She had to find a way out before the house decided to swallow her whole. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the sudden vibration making her nearly drop the journal. She fumbled to pull it out, her heart racing with a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a signal here. Perhaps she could call for help. The screen was glowing, but to her dismay, the signal bars were still non-existent. There was, however, an incoming call from an unknown number. The caller ID was just a series of strange symbols that made no sense. Emily hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the answer button. The house had already proven that it could manipulate reality. Could she trust this call? But as the phone kept vibrating, a nagging feeling in her gut told her she couldn't ignore it. Against her better judgment, she swiped to answer. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The line crackled with static, the sound so loud it made her wince. For a few moments, all she could hear was the distorted hiss, like 100 voices whispering at once. Then, through the noise, a voice came through, faint but unmistakable. It was soft, trembling, and strangely familiar. "Emily, Emily, can you hear me?" Her blood ran cold. It was Eliza Vandermeer's voice, the same one that had whispered to her through the audio recorder. The same voice that had echoed from the shadows in the basement. "What do you want?" Emily's voice was shaking, but she forced herself to sound strong. "Why are you doing this?" The static crackled louder, and the voice on the other end seemed to waver, as if it were struggling to break through some unseen barrier. "Listen to me," Eliza said, her voice urgent now, almost pleading. "The house, it feeds on fear. It twists time and space. That's why you can't find your way out. It's playing with you, trying to break you." Emily's hands clenched around the phone. "Then how do I stop it? How do I escape?" Eliza's voice was interrupted by a burst of static, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint rhythmic tapping of fingernails against wood. Then the voice returned, softer now, filled with a despair that sent chills down Emily's spine. "You must find the heart of the house," Eliza whispered. "It's where it all began. The source of its power lies deep underground, in the catacombs beneath the foundations. That's where they took us. That's where—" The voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a blood-curdling scream that made Emily's blood run cold. The scream was a mixture of agony and terror, like the sound of someone being ripped apart. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the line went dead. Emily stared at her phone, her hands shaking so violently that she nearly dropped it. The call was gone, and the screen was dark. The only sound now was the steady thud of her own heartbeat. The catacombs, deep underground, that was where the answers lay. But how was she supposed to find them in this ever-shifting maze of a house? She was still trying to process Eliza's words when the whispering started again, this time louder and more insistent. The nursery door, which she had slammed shut behind her, began to rattle violently. The handle twisted and shook, as if something on the other side was trying to break through. Panic surged through Emily. She couldn't stay here. She had to move, to find the entrance to the catacombs before whatever was lurking on the other side of the door got to her. She bolted out of the nursery, sprinting down the hallway. The house seemed to react to her decision, the walls shifting and warping as if it were trying to confuse her. Doorways appeared where there had been none before, and corridors twisted in impossible angles. But Emily kept running, her mind focused on one thing. She had to find the basement entrance again. If the catacombs existed, they would likely be hidden beneath the old stone foundations. The whispers were growing louder now, echoing from every direction. The house seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, the very walls vibrating with a dark hum. As Emily turned a corner, she skidded to a halt. In front of her was a large, ornately carved door that she hadn't seen before. It was different from the others. This one was covered in strange runes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The air around it was colder, almost frigid, and a faint, acrid smell emanated from the cracks around the doorframe. Taking a deep breath, Emily reached for the handle. It was ice cold to the touch, and a shiver ran through her as she turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a stone staircase leading downward into pitch darkness. The smell of damp earth and decay wafted up to meet her, nearly making her gag. This must be it, she thought. The catacombs, the heart of the house. With no other choice, she descended the staircase. The darkness was so thick it felt like a living thing, pressing in on her from all sides. Her flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, casting only a narrow beam that revealed slick stone walls and the occasional scurrying shape that she chose to ignore. As she reached the bottom, she found herself in a vast underground chamber. The air was thick with a fetid stench, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of water that soaked into her shoes. The sound of dripping water echoed in the distance, along with faint, echoing whispers that sent chills down her spine. In the center of the chamber was a massive stone altar, covered with more of the strange runes she had seen upstairs. Around it were remnants of old, rusted chains and shackles. Emily's heart sank as she realized what this place was. The journal had hinted at it, but now it was clear this was where the rituals had taken place, where the house had first been tainted with darkness. As she approached the altar, the air grew even colder, and the whispers turned into agonized wails. Emily's flashlight flickered, and she caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, a dark, hulking figure with glowing eyes. The house had been waiting for her. The shadows surged forward, surrounding her in a whirl of darkness. Emily screamed, trying to back away, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to turn to quicksand, pulling her closer to the altar. She could hear the voices now, clearer than ever, chanting her name over and over, as if they were trying to summon something. Then, from the darkness, Eliza's voice broke through, clear and desperate. "Destroy the heart. It's the only way to break the curse." Emily's eyes darted to the altar. It was the source, the heart of the house's power. Summoning all her strength, she grabbed a rusted iron rod from the ground and slammed it into the center of the altar with all her might. A deafening roar filled the chamber, and the ground beneath her shook violently. The shadows writhed in agony, their screams filling the air. The house itself seemed to tremble, its ancient walls groaning in protest. But the darkness did not retreat. It was angry now, furious. Emily could feel it closing in, the shadows reaching for her with skeletal hands. She pulled the rod out and struck the altar again, her vision blurring as the house screamed in rage. And then there was a blinding flash of light. The ground beneath her gave way, and Emily felt herself falling, plunging into the darkness below. The last thing she heard was Eliza's voice, whispering softly in her ear. "Run, Emily, run while you—" Darkness swallowed Emily as she plummeted through the collapsing floor, the cold, damp air rushing past her like a howling wind. She had no idea how far she fell, but when she finally hit the ground, pain exploded in her side, knocking the breath from her lungs. For a few agonizing moments, she lay there, stunned, gasping for air in the pitch-black void. The sound of crumbling stone and debris echoed around her as the floor above sealed itself shut. She was now completely isolated, deep beneath the house, with only the faint, distant drip of water to keep her company. Her flashlight had been knocked from her grip during the fall, and it was nowhere to be seen. She tried to ignore the suffocating darkness that pressed in on her like a physical weight. Emily forced herself to move, wincing as pain shot through her leg. It wasn't broken, but she was bruised and battered from the fall. Taking a deep breath, she fumbled for her backup light, a small, emergency glow stick she kept in her pocket. Cracking it open, she was relieved to see a faint green glow fill the area around her. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see by. As the pale light illuminated her surroundings, Emily realized she was in a different part of the house, far below even the basement she had explored earlier. The walls here were ancient, made of rough-hewn stone slick with moisture. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and something far more foul, like decaying flesh. She was in a narrow underground passageway that seemed to stretch on endlessly in both directions. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she chose the path to her right and began to limp forward, every nerve in her body screaming that she was heading deeper into danger. But she had no choice. Eliza's words still echoed in her mind, the heart of the house, the catacombs. The passage twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, her breath forming clouds in the dim glow of her light. The whispers had returned, distant and muffled, as if they were coming from behind the walls. Emily gripped the journal tightly, praying it might offer some guidance. But as she flipped through its pages, she found them blank, as if the house had decided to withhold its secrets. Finally, the passageway opened up into a large, cavernous chamber. The glow stick's faint light barely penetrated the darkness, but Emily could make out the rough shapes of stone columns and what appeared to be an altar in the center of the room. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, slick with a thin film of water that smelled faintly of sulfur. As she approached the altar, the air seemed to hum with a dark energy. Strange, intricate symbols were carved into the stone floor, forming a twisted circle around the altar. They were the same symbols she had seen before, but here they were larger, more detailed, glowing faintly as if alive with their own malevolent light. The altar itself was covered in remnants of old, rusted chains and shackles. Scattered around it were tattered pieces of clothing and broken bones. Emily's stomach churned as she realized she was standing in the center of a ritual chamber, one that had seen its share of sacrifices. A sudden noise made her whirl around, her glow stick casting eerie shadows on the walls. She could hear the faint patter of footsteps echoing through the chamber, but when she strained her ears, the sound stopped, replaced by a low guttural whisper that seemed to come from the very stones themselves. "You've come so far, Emily," the whispering voice said, low and taunting. "But you're too late. You can't stop what's been set in motion." The voice sent chills down her spine, and she turned back to the altar, her mind racing. What had Eliza meant by destroying the heart of the house? Emily scanned the symbols carved into the floor, trying to decipher their meaning, but it was like looking at an alien language. She flipped open the journal again, hoping for something, anything, that could guide her. To her shock, new words began to appear on the page, scrawled in a frenzied hand. "The heart is bound by blood, by sacrifice. Break the bond or be consumed." Sacrifice, blood. Emily's mind raced. If the heart of the house was bound by a ritual, then perhaps it could be undone by disrupting it. She looked around the altar and noticed something glinting in the faint green glow of her light, a small ornate dagger, its blade stained with dried blood. Before she could reach for it, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The entire chamber shook, dust and pebbles raining down from the ceiling. From the shadows at the far end of the room, dark shapes began to emerge. They were tall, cloaked figures, their forms shrouded in darkness, their eyes glowing an unnatural red. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the figures moved closer, their whispers filling the air like a swarm of angry bees. She grabbed the dagger from the altar, her hands shaking, and turned to face them. The figures stopped just at the edge of the glowing circle on the floor, as if they were unable to cross it. A deep, rumbling voice echoed through the chamber, reverberating in her bones. "You think you can stop us? The heart is bound, sealed with the blood of the innocent. You cannot break what was forged in darkness." Emily gripped the dagger tighter, her mind racing. She realized that the heart of the house wasn't just a metaphor, it was a literal source of power, something hidden within the altar itself. Eliza had tried to tell her. The house was bound to this place, to whatever dark force had been summoned here. With a surge of determination, Emily raised the dagger and plunged it into the center of the altar. The ground shook violently, and a horrific scream erupted from the walls, as if the house itself was in agony. The red-eyed figures recoiled, their forms flickering like dying flames. But it wasn't enough. The altar glowed brighter, the symbols on the floor pulsing with dark energy. The shadows began to surge forward again, their whispers turning into a deafening roar. Desperate, Emily remembered the journal's cryptic message. The heart is bound by blood, her own blood. That was the key. Without hesitating, she sliced her palm open with the dagger, letting her blood drip onto the altar. The effect was immediate. The chamber erupted in a blinding flash of light, the force of it nearly knocking her off her feet. The red-eyed figures screamed, their forms disintegrating into clouds of black mist. The altar began to crack, dark energy leaking from its core like a bleeding wound. The whispers turned into agonized wails as the walls of the chamber shook and crumbled. The house was collapsing in on itself. Emily knew she had only moments to escape. She bolted for the passageway, her injured leg screaming in pain. As she sprinted up the narrow tunnel, the walls shook violently, debris crashing down around her. The entire house was coming apart, the dark magic that held it together unraveling with each step she took. With one final burst of adrenaline, she hurled herself up the staircase, through the twisting corridors, and toward the front door. The house groaned and buckled, the floor beneath her feet cracking open as if it were trying to swallow her whole. Finally, she reached the entrance. The door, which had been sealed tight before, now hung ajar, creaking in the fierce wind that howled through the collapsing structure. Emily threw herself through the doorway just as the house let out one final deafening scream. She tumbled out onto the cold, wet grass outside, gasping for air. Behind her, the Vandermeer house crumbled in on itself, collapsing into a pile of rubble and dust as if it had never existed. For a long moment she lay there, staring up at the night sky, the stars blinking down at her like distant eyes. The oppressive weight that had clung to her since she entered the house was gone. The whispers had finally stopped. But as she pushed herself up, blood still dripping from her wounded palm, her phone buzzed again. Dread pooled in her stomach as she pulled it out, staring at the screen. The message was simple, written in the same jagged script that had appeared in the journal. This is only the beginning. You may have destroyed this house, but the darkness still knows your name, Emily. The screen went dark, and in the silence that followed, Emily realized that the nightmare wasn't truly over. The house was gone, but the darkness that had claimed it was still out there. And it was coming for her. Emily staggered through the overgrown yard, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The collapse of the Vandermeer house behind her had left a gaping crater in the earth, like a festering wound that refused to heal. Dust and debris still hung in the air, illuminated by the faint glow of a distant moon. The cold night air stung her cut palm, but she hardly felt the pain. All she could think about was the message that had appeared on her phone. The darkness still knows your name. She was free at least. She was outside the house, but her mind was still reeling from what she had witnessed. Eliza's voice echoed in her thoughts, a desperate plea that kept replaying over and over. You may have destroyed the house, but the darkness remains. Emily stumbled toward her car, which was parked at the end of the long, overgrown driveway. She could barely see it through the thick fog that had begun to settle over the landscape like a ghostly shroud. Every instinct told her to get as far away from this cursed place as possible, to flee back to the safety of the town. But she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The darkness had already marked her. Wherever she went, it would follow. As she approached her car, she fumbled in her pocket for the keys, her hands still shaking. But as she unlocked the door, her phone buzzed again. This time the screen flickered erratically, displaying that same cryptic caller ID, a series of strange symbols that twisted and distorted before her eyes. Her heart pounded. She had to know, had to confirm that this nightmare wasn't truly over. With a deep breath, she answered the call. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The line was filled with the familiar crackle of static, but beneath it she could hear soft, uneven breathing, as if someone on the other end was struggling to speak. "Emily, you must listen." The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the static, but Emily recognized it immediately. It was Eliza. She was still reaching out, even after the destruction of the house. They're not gone. They're still coming for you. Emily's blood ran cold. I destroyed the heart, she said, her voice tinged with desperation. I did what you told me to. The house, it's gone. No. Eliza's voice crackled, cutting in and out like a weak radio signal. You broke the binding, yes, but the darkness was never confined to the house alone. It's a hunger that spreads, a curse that latches on to the living. Before Emily could respond, the call cut out with a piercing shriek of static. She dropped the phone, clutching her ears as the noise reverberated through her skull. When she looked at the screen again, it was blank, the battery completely drained. A low, cold fog rolled in from the woods surrounding the house's remains, swallowing the trees in its thick embrace. Emily's car headlights barely pierced the mist as she climbed into the driver's seat. She turned the ignition, praying the engine would start. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sputter, the car roared to life. Relief flooded her, and she jammed the car into reverse, desperate to put as much distance between herself and this nightmare as possible. But as she backed up, her rearview mirror revealed a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the driveway. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was the same figure she had seen in the attic, the same one that had haunted her every step in the house, a tall, gaunt form cloaked in darkness, with eyes that glowed like burning coals. Panicking, she slammed the car into drive and hit the gas. The tires screeched as she sped down the fog-shrouded road, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was chasing her, stretching out unseen tendrils that clawed at the edges of her mind. The road twisted and turned through the dense forest, and every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like whispering voices. She kept glancing at her rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure gaining on her. But the road behind her remained empty, swallowed by the fog. After what felt like hours, the road finally straightened, and she spotted the distant glow of Hollow Pines town lights. Emily felt a surge of hope. She was almost safe. But as she rounded the last bend, her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was Eliza. Emily slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just inches from the ghostly figure. Eliza stood there, her form flickering like a dying flame, her eyes hollow and filled with an unearthly light. She looked more like a shadow than a person now, her once beautiful face twisted by the horrors she had endured. "Please," Emily whispered, rolling down her window. "I did everything you said. Why won't it stop?" Eliza's lips barely moved as she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. "The darkness is not bound to the house alone. It has grown, fed on fear, on suffering, on your fear. It will not stop unless you sever the source." "The source," Emily's mind raced. "I destroyed the altar, the heart, what else is there?" But before Eliza could answer, her form began to flicker violently, as though some unseen force was trying to pull her away. "It's in the roots," she managed to say, her voice filled with pain. "Deep beneath, where it all began." With that, Eliza's form disintegrated into a cloud of black mist, which was quickly swallowed by the encroaching fog. Emily was left alone on the deserted road, her car's headlights casting long, trembling shadows that danced in the mist. "Deep beneath," Emily murmured to herself, trying to make sense of Eliza's final words. It was then that she remembered the strange journal entry she had seen earlier, the one that mentioned ancient roots and catacombs that ran deeper than the basement. The house had been just the surface. The true source of the darkness was buried far deeper, entwined with the earth itself. The catacombs had only been the beginning. There was something even older, more powerful, lying dormant beneath the cursed grounds of Hollow Pines. Realizing there was no true escape, she knew what she had to do. She couldn't run from the darkness. It would only follow her, growing stronger the longer it was left unchecked. She had to go back, to find the true source of the curse and destroy it once and for all. Emily turned the car around, her hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled determination. She drove back toward the ruins of the Vandermeer house, the fog closing in around her like a death shroud. The air grew colder, and the whispering voices returned, taunting her, urging her to give in to her fear. But this time, she wasn't going to let it consume her. She had faced the darkness before, and now she understood its nature. The shadows couldn't claim her unless she let them. With newfound resolve, she stepped out of the car and made her way back toward the collapsed ruins of the house. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Somewhere deep below her, the true source of the darkness waited, and she was ready to face it. For she now understood. The heart of the house may have been destroyed, but the darkness had ancient roots that ran deeper than any foundation. She would find those roots, and this time she would tear them out, no matter the cost. Emily stood at the edge of the rubble where the Vandermeer house had once loomed, its oppressive presence now replaced by a gaping, smoldering crater. The wind whipped around her, carrying with it the faint scent of burning wood, and something far more sinister, a sulfuric tang that stung her nostrils and made her eyes water. The darkness that surrounded her was alive, pressing against her like a suffocating shroud. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run as far as she could. But she couldn't. Not now. She knew that if she didn't face the darkness tonight, it would hunt her down wherever she went. Eliza's voice echoed in her mind. It's in the roots, deep beneath where it all began. Steeling herself, Emily activated her last remaining flashlight. Its beam cut through the mist, revealing the remnants of the collapsed house. The crater was deeper than she had expected, a jagged maw that seemed to lead straight into the bowels of the earth. The air here was colder, almost icy, and it carried with it a strange, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat coming from deep underground. As she approached the edge, the ground beneath her feet gave way slightly, sending loose stones tumbling into the darkness below. She peered over the edge and saw a narrow set of stone steps winding downward into the depths of the earth, partially hidden by thick, creeping vines that pulsed with a sickly, greenish light. Taking a deep breath, Emily began her descent. The temperature dropped further with each step, and the air grew heavier, tinged with the metallic scent of blood. The further she descended, the more distant the outside world seemed. It was as if the darkness below was swallowing her whole, cutting her off from everything she had ever known. The staircase finally opened into a vast underground cavern. The air was thick with an acrid fog, and Emily had to cover her nose with her sleeve to keep from gagging. The cavern was massive, its ceiling lost in shadows. The stone walls were covered with ancient, twisted roots that seemed to pulse and writhe, like veins filled with dark energy. The roots glowed faintly, casting an eerie, greenish light that provided just enough illumination to navigate by. In the center of the cavern, Emily's flashlight beam revealed a massive stone structure, a grotesque altar surrounded by pillars carved with horrifying images of twisted faces and contorted bodies. It was far larger than the altar she had destroyed in the catacombs, its malevolent presence sending chills down her spine. This was it, the true heart of the darkness, the place where the roots of the curse ran deepest. As she approached, she could feel the ground beneath her feet vibrating, as if the earth itself was thrumming with dark energy. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. They came from every direction, overlapping and echoing, filling her mind with thoughts that weren't her own. You are too late, Emily. The darkness will consume you. You belong to us now. Emily shook her head, trying to clear her mind. She had come too far to be swayed by their taunts. But as she drew closer to the altar, she realized that the structure was surrounded by dozens of figures, twisted, shadowy forms with glowing eyes. They stood silently, watching her, their forms flickering like flames in the darkness. One of the figures stepped forward. It was taller than the others, its form more solid, and its eyes burned with a searing intensity. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized it. It was the same figure that had haunted her since she had first stepped into the Vandermeer house. The same entity that had appeared in her rearview mirror, its grin wide and malicious. "You cannot destroy us," the figure hissed, its voice a chorus of 1,000 overlapping whispers. "We have been here long before you, long before the Vandermeers. We are rooted in the earth, in the blood that was spilled to bind this place." Emily's fingers tightened around the dagger she had taken from the basement. Her only hope was to disrupt whatever ritual had bound these entities to this place. She could feel the energy radiating from the altar, the twisted roots around it pulsing with a dark, malignant force. She had to cut it off at the source. With a burst of adrenaline, she charged toward the altar, raising the dagger high. But the ground beneath her erupted, and thick, serpentine roots shot up, wrapping around her ankles and dragging her down. The shadowy figures began to close in, their glowing eyes filled with malevolent hunger. Emily screamed, slashing at the roots with her dagger, trying to free herself. But for every root she severed, 2 more took its place, tightening their grip around her legs and wrists. The whispers grew louder, almost a roar now, drowning out her thoughts. She could feel the darkness pressing into her mind, trying to take hold. Then in the chaos, she remembered Eliza's final words. The heart is bound by blood, by sacrifice. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. The altar was not just a source of power, it was a conduit, feeding on the fear and blood of those who had been trapped here. If she wanted to destroy it, she would have to sever its connection to the darkness in a way that would break the cycle once and for all. Gritting her teeth, Emily gripped the dagger tighter and with a scream, plunged it into her own wounded palm. Pain exploded through her, but she forced herself to drag her bleeding hand across the altar, smearing it with her own blood. The moment her blood touched the stone, the entire cavern shook violently, the ground splitting open as if the earth itself was crying out in pain. The shadowy figures shrieked, their forms flickering and fading as if they were being torn apart. The roots that held her began to wither, their grip loosening as dark, oily smoke billowed out from the cracks in the altar. Emily stumbled back, clutching her bleeding hand. The whispers turned to wails of agony as the altar began to collapse, the pillars around it crumbling like sand. The shadows surged one last time, trying to reach her, but they were losing their hold on the physical world. The entire cavern was collapsing now, the ground shaking so violently that Emily could barely keep her footing. She had to get out now. She turned and sprinted toward the stone staircase, the walls around her crumbling, sending chunks of rock crashing down. The twisted roots flailed wildly, their last attempt to stop her, but they were weakening, their dark energy draining away. She reached the staircase and began to climb, her legs burning with exhaustion. The roar of the collapsing cavern grew louder, a tidal wave of dust and debris chasing her up the steps. As she reached the top, she threw herself through the opening just as the ground below gave way, swallowing the cavern and everything within it. Emily tumbled onto the wet grass, gasping for air. Behind her, the earth heaved one final time, then went still. The crater where the house had once stood was now filled with rubble and dust. The twisted roots that had once pulsed with dark energy, now nothing more than lifeless tendrils. The whispers had stopped. The darkness was gone. For the first time, the air was clear. The oppressive weight that had clung to her since she first entered the Vandermeer property finally lifted. Emily lay there for a moment, staring up at the stars. She was free. But as she pushed herself up, wiping the blood from her hand, she heard a soft whisper, just a single voice this time, faint and almost imperceptible, carried on the wind. "It's not over, Emily. The darkness is patient. It will find another way." A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to stand. She had done what she came to do. For now, at least, the curse was broken. But as she walked back toward her car, the cold wind whispered through the trees, and she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, deep in the earth, something was still watching her. And it was waiting. Emily leaned heavily against her car, her body trembling with exhaustion. The ruins of the Vandermeer house were now nothing more than a jagged crater filled with rubble, the twisted roots and ancient stones swallowed by the earth. The night air was cold, but it felt clean for the first time since she'd arrived. The oppressive, suffocating presence of the house was finally gone, or so she desperately wanted to believe. She fumbled in her pocket for the keys, her hands slick with blood and mud. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to leave this cursed place behind, to drive as far as she could and never look back. But as she slid into the driver's seat, something stopped her, a whisper, faint and almost imperceptible, like the soft rustle of leaves in a forgotten forest. It was the same whisper she had heard right before the house collapsed. "It's not over, Emily. We will find you." She froze, her heart pounding. For a moment, she was paralyzed, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, she turned the key. The engine sputtered to life, and she slammed her foot on the gas pedal, her tires skidding on the damp ground as she sped down the winding road. The trees lining the road seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches like skeletal fingers reaching for her car. The wind howled through the night, carrying with it fragments of voices, disjointed, desperate whispers that clawed at her sanity. Emily kept her eyes on the road, refusing to look in the rearview mirror, knowing that if she did, she might see them, the shadows, the figures with their glowing eyes that had haunted her since she first stepped foot on the cursed property. As the lights of Hollow Pines came into view, she allowed herself a breath of relief. She was almost out, almost safe. But just as she crossed the town's threshold, her phone buzzed on the passenger seat beside her. The screen was shattered, but she could still see the message that had appeared. "You cannot run, Emily. The darkness has already marked you. There is no escape." A cold dread settled in her stomach. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel as she swerved into the town's main street, passing the shuttered shops and darkened homes. She needed help, someone to confirm she was free of whatever had taken hold of her. The town's small police station was just ahead, a place that, in her panicked mind, represented some semblance of safety. But when she pulled into the parking lot, she realized something was wrong. The lights inside the station were flickering, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to writhe like serpents on the walls. The front door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Steeling herself, Emily grabbed her flashlight and got out of the car. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and every step she took toward the station sent a wave of nausea through her. She pushed open the door, the sound echoing in the empty space. "Hello, is anyone here?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no response. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt like a living thing, watching and waiting. She moved through the dimly lit corridors, her flashlight beam sweeping over empty desks and overturned chairs. As she reached the back of the station, she found a door marked Evidence Room. Something about it called to her, a sick pull in her gut that she couldn't ignore. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was cold, the air thick with the scent of mildew and something far worse, something rotting. In the center of the room was a table, and on that table was a journal. Her journal. The same one she had taken from the Vandermeer house, covered in her own blood. "How?" she whispered, her voice breaking. She had left the journal behind in the collapsing catacombs. It should have been buried under tons of rubble. But here trembling, she reached for the journal, her fingers brushing the familiar cracked leather cover. The moment she touched it, the lights in the room flickered and the temperature dropped. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding her, filling her mind with dark, incomprehensible thoughts. She flipped open the journal, and to her horror, she saw that the pages were no longer filled with the frenzied scrawlings of Eliza Vandermeer. They were filled with entries in her own handwriting. "I thought I could escape it, but the darkness has followed me. It's inside me now, twisting my thoughts, turning my memories against me. I am becoming what the house wants me to be, a vessel, a new heart for the shadows." Emily's vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. How was this possible? She didn't remember writing any of it, but the words on the page were unmistakably hers. And then she heard it, a soft, mocking laugh coming from the shadows behind her. Turning slowly, she saw a figure materialize from the darkness. It was Eliza, but she was no longer the desperate, tormented spirit Emily had encountered before. Her eyes were now black voids, her mouth twisted into a sinister smile. "Did you really think you could destroy it?" Eliza whispered, her voice echoing with 1,000 overlapping tones. "The house was just a shell. The darkness lives within those it marks, and now it lives in you." "No," Emily choked out, stumbling backward. "I destroyed the heart. I severed the bond." Eliza's twisted smile widened. "You severed one bond, yes, but the house is clever. It needed a new heart to anchor it, a new vessel, and you were the perfect choice." Emily's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. She could feel it now, the darkness that had been lurking in the edges of her mind, creeping ever closer. The journal in her hand seemed to pulse with a sick energy, binding itself to her with invisible chains. "You see," Eliza continued, her form flickering like a broken projection, "you were chosen the moment you entered the house. It fed on your fear, your desperation, and it used you to break the old seals. You didn't destroy the darkness, Emily. You freed it." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she tried to claw at the journal, but it wouldn't release her grip. She could feel the shadows pouring into her, filling her veins with ice. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to drown out her own thoughts. The darkness wasn't something she could fight or escape. It was already inside her. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed Eliza and all those before her. The last thing she saw before the world went black was Eliza's triumphant smile, her hollow eyes filled with the terrible knowledge of what was to come. Weeks later, the townsfolk of Hollow Pines would speak in hushed whispers of the strange events that had occurred on that cursed night. The old Vandermeer house had finally collapsed into the earth, and the strange lights that had plagued the town for decades had finally ceased. But the story did not end there. Emily Clark's car was found abandoned on the outskirts of town, the doors left wide open. The driver's seat was stained with blood, and her journal lay open on the dashboard, filled with entries that no one could explain. The final entry was written in a shaky hand. "I can't hold on much longer. It's inside me. If you find this, do not return to Hollow Pines. Do not follow the whispers. The darkness has taken me, and soon it will find you too." The journal was closed, placed in an evidence locker, and forgotten. But on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, the townsfolk swore they could hear her voice, faint and desperate, whispering from the shadows. "Run while you can. The darkness never dies. It only waits for another to answer its call."